They say no man in the world would choose Clara Whitmore, and for years she almost believed it. But when the most dangerous man on the frontier walks into her shop, everything Red Hollow ever knew about her crumbles. This is the story of the woman the town gave up on, and the only man brave enough to see what they missed. If you love stories of strength, love, and survival on the wild frontier, hit like, comment the name of the city you're watching so I know how far my story has progressed, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next installment. The trouble with Red Hollow was that everybody knew everybody else's business, and most of them were wrong about most of it. It was a settlement that had clawed itself out of the Kansas prairie sometime in the late 1870s, the kind of place that looked like it might blow away in a hard wind and sometimes wished it would. There was a livery stable, a dry goods operation, a saloon that smelled of wood smoke and old grudges, a church that half the congregation attended and the other half avoided, and one general supply post that stood at the far end of Main Street like an afterthought, weathered gray boards, a sagging porch overhang, and a hand-painted sign that read, "Whitmore Supply," in letters that had faded to the color of old bone. That was Clara's place. Or rather, it had been her father's place, and then he died of a chest sickness the winter before last, and it became hers by default because there was no one else to take it. She was 26 years old. She was not what people meant when they talked about a handsome woman. She was big, broad through the shoulders, heavy through the hips and middle, built the way working women were built when the work was real and the years were hard. Her hands were rough from stacking crates and hauling grain sacks. Her face was plain and honest, with dark eyes that had a habit of watching things carefully, and brown hair she wore pinned back because she didn't have time for anything more elaborate than that. The town had made up its mind about Clara Whitmore a long time ago, the way small towns do. They had filed her away in a particular drawer labeled spinster, permanent, not worth discussing, and considered the matter settled. "She's a good enough woman," Mabel Greer had been overheard saying at the general store one afternoon, loud enough that Clara, stocking shelves in the next aisle, could hear every word. But Lord, what man's going to take on all of that? She'd break a chair just sitting in the church pew. Laughter. Not cruel laughter, exactly. The kind that came from women who told themselves they weren't being cruel, they were just being honest. Clara had set down the tin of dried beans she was holding very carefully and continued working. That was something she had learned to do. Continue working. It was the only answer she had found to most of Red Hollow's opinions about her, and while it wasn't a satisfying answer, it was a reliable one. The supply post kept her occupied from before sunup to well after dark most days. She tracked inventory in her father's old ledger, haggled with suppliers who came through on the freight road, extended credit to families she knew were struggling, and collected payment from the ones who weren't. She could read a bill of goods faster than any man in town, could do arithmetic in her head that left the bank clerk flustered, and had a memory for prices and quantities that bordered on unsettling. None of this impressed Red Hollow. Red Hollow was interested in whether a woman could attract a husband, and by that measure, Clara Whitmore was a failure, and the town felt comfortable reminding her of it on a fairly regular basis. There was a particular group of men, drifters mostly, the kind who passed through and stayed longer than anyone expected, who had made something of a game out of it. They'd lean against the porch railing outside the saloon when Clara walked past on her way to the freight office, and they'd say things, nothing that crossed a line anyone could point to. Just things. Comments about her size, suggestions about what kind of man might be desperate enough. Once, one of them had called out that she ought to charge extra for the shadow she cast, and the others had laughed like it was the funniest thing they'd heard all year. Clara had kept walking. She was good at that too. The hardest part wasn't the cruelty. The hardest part was the pity, which came from people who thought they were being kind. Women who touched her arm at the dry goods counter and said things like, "I'm sure someone will come along," in the tone you used with children who had lost something and were never going to find it. Men who gave her a certain look when she quoted them fair prices, a look that said, "She's smart. It's a shame about the rest of it." She had stopped attending the Saturday socials, not because she was forbidden, but because standing in the corner of the church hall watching other women get asked to dance while nobody looked at her. That particular variety of nothing was worse than staying home with a book and a candle. So she stayed home. She worked. She kept the supply post running because it was hers, and because her father had spent 30 years building it, and because she didn't know what else to do with herself. Winter came early that year, driving down from the north with a mean edge to it, and for a few weeks the town pulled inward and left Clara mostly alone, which suited her fine. She was taking inventory of her seed stock in the back storeroom one gray November morning when she heard the bell above the front door jangle. She came out wiping her hands on her apron, expecting one of the Harmon boys or maybe old Pete Duggan looking to settle his account. It was neither. The man standing in her doorway was enormous, not in the soft, overfed way of merchants and bankers, but in the way of something that had been shaped by years of hard weather and harder labor, all of it packed down and compressed until it was as dense and immovable as mountain rock. He was well over 6 feet, wearing a heavy canvas coat that had seen serious use, trapper's leggings of cured hide, and boots that were caked with the kind of mud that came from serious distance. He had a beard that was more black than gray, and eyes the color of a winter sky, pale, flat, and difficult to read. He looked around the store once, slowly, the way a man looks at a new place when he's deciding whether it's safe. Then he looked at Clara. "I need provisions," he said. His voice was low and level, the kind of voice that didn't waste itself on extra volume. "You've come to the right place," Clara said. She had expected him to look away. Most men who came into the store looked at her for a moment and then looked past her, as if her face were a fence post and the actual destination was somewhere behind it. This man didn't do that. He kept his eyes on her face with a directness that was almost unsettling in its simplicity. "What are you needing?" she asked. He produced a folded paper from his coat and set it on the counter. She unfolded it, a neat list, written in a careful, deliberate hand. Salt, hardtack, dried beans, rope, cartridge powder, lard, 2 traps, the heavy-set kind for bear work, and a bolt of oilcloth. "This is a winter supply," she said. "Yes." "You're going up into the mountains." "Already been," he said, heading back. She looked at the list again, calculating. "I've got most of this. The traps I have 1 of, not 2. Hargrove's in Milford carries the heavy set, but that's a half-day's ride." "I know, came from there. So you've already been to Milford." "Wanted to see what you had first." She glanced up at him. There was nothing in his expression that told her why, particularly he would want to see her stock before Hargrove's, which was a bigger operation with better supplied shelves. She decided not to ask. She filled his order. He watched her work. Not impatiently, not making conversation, just watching in that quiet, attentive way, like a man who had learned that being still and paying attention cost less than most other things. When she set the last item on the counter and quoted him the total, he counted out exact coin without argument, which immediately made him one of her more pleasant customers. "You're the Whitmore woman," he said. "I am." "Henry Whitmore's daughter." She looked at him more carefully. "You knew my father?" "Bought rope from him 5 years ago, maybe 6. A pause. "He was a fair dealer." "He was," Clara said, and felt something small and tight in her chest that she didn't let show on her face. The man picked up his wrap supplies and tucked them under his arm. He turned toward the door, then stopped. "Boone Mercer," he said, without turning around. "What?" "My name." He turned then, just enough to glance back at her. "In case you were wondering." And then he was gone, the bell jangling once above the door and then going still. Clara stood behind her counter for a long moment, looking at the space where he'd been. Boone Mercer, she'd heard that name. Everybody in Red Hollow had heard it, the same way you heard stories about lightning strikes and rock slides. At a distance, with a vague understanding that the thing being described was real, but unlikely to touch you personally. He was a mountain trapper who worked the ranges west of the settlement, the kind of country where even experienced hunters lost themselves and didn't come back. He'd been doing it for years. He didn't have a ranch, didn't have a claim, didn't have any of the things that made a man legible to the society of a frontier town. He came down from the mountains a few times a year to trade furs and buy supplies, and he stayed in no one place long enough for anyone to know him. The stories about him varied depending on who was telling them. Some said he'd killed men. Others said he'd survived things that should have killed him. A few people just said he was strange, which in Red Hollow was sometimes the most damning thing you could say about a person. He came back 3 weeks later. Clara was behind the counter when he walked in, and she looked up from her ledger and said, "Mr. Mercer," and he nodded at her the way you nodded at someone you intended to deal with fairly. He bought supplies again. Less this time. Coffee, mostly, and a coil of good wire. They talked about prices. He asked her about the freight road conditions south of town, and she told him what she knew, and he listened in that still, focused way he had. When he left, he paused at the door. "You make good coffee?" he asked. She blinked. "Passable." He nodded, as if that were satisfying, and walked out. She stood there for a moment and then went back to her ledger, not quite sure what to make of it. He came back again 2 weeks after that. By the fourth visit, Red Hollow had noticed. A town like Red Hollow always noticed. It was one of its primary functions. "He's using her," May Sutton announced at the dressmaker's shop, in the way people announce things they'd already decided were true. Probably getting better prices because she's grateful for the attention. "Grateful," echoed her friend Dora in a tone that communicated a great deal without saying much. "Well, what else could it be?" May said. "A man like that, and a woman like her." Clara heard none of this directly, but she heard enough of it secondhand through the particular silence that fell in conversations when she walked up to people who had been discussing her. She had learned to read that silence the way she read weather. The specific quality of it told you most of what you needed to know. The fifth time Boone came in, it was late in the afternoon, and the light through the windows was the low amber kind that happened in December, and the store was empty of other customers. He bought coffee again, and a length of good leather cord, and then he stood at the counter for a moment longer than was necessary. "You run this place alone," he said. "I do." "Since your father died." "Yes." He looked around the store slowly, at the organized shelves, the neat stacks of goods, the ledger open on the counter. "You're good at it." "I am," she said. Not defensively, just the fact of it. Something shifted in his expression, barely perceptible. "What do you want from it?" She opened her mouth and then closed it again, because it was such an unexpected question that she didn't have an answer ready. "From the store," he said, clarifying, though something in the way he said it suggested he might mean more than that. "I want it to keep running," she said, finally. "I want to keep the account straight and the stock full and the credit extended to people who deserve it and denied to people who don't. I want—" She stopped. "Go on," he said. "I want to do the work well. I've always wanted that. It's enough." She said the last sentence a beat too quickly. He looked at her. "Is it?" She didn't answer that one. He picked up his goods and she thought he was leaving, and then he said without particular emphasis, "There's a valley, west of the high ridge. I've been building there 2 years, cabin's solid, land's good, water comes off the mountain clean." Clara looked at him. "I'm not a man who does well with a lot of talking," he said. "So I'll say it straight. I'm looking for a partner, someone who can think and work and keep track of things. Someone who doesn't need to be told that life up there is hard, because they already know that life is hard." The store was very quiet. Somewhere outside, a horse shifted its weight against a hitching post, and the boards creaked. "You're asking me," Clara said. It wasn't quite a question. "I'm asking you," he said. She felt the strangeness of it settle over her, not the warm, ringing strangeness of something being given, but the colder, more complicated strangeness of being seen unexpectedly, in a place where you had long since stopped expecting it. "Why me?" she said. Also, not quite a question. He thought about it for a moment in that deliberate way he had. "Because every time I've come in here, you've dealt with me straight. You haven't tried to charm me or impress me or figure out what I wanted to hear. You know your stock and your prices and your accounts. You work hard and you don't complain about it." Another pause. "And because I've watched how people treat you in this town, and I think you deserve better than what they've decided about you." The honesty of it landed differently than flattery would have. Flattery she could have dismissed. This she couldn't quite dismiss. "I don't know you," she said. "No," he agreed. "You'd be taking a chance." "So would you." "Yes," he said. "That's how it works." She looked at him for a long moment. She looked at the store around her, the work she'd poured herself into, the shelves she'd stocked, the accounts she'd kept. She thought about May Sutton's voice at the dressmaker's, and the particular silence that fell in conversations, and the Saturday socials she'd stopped going to, and all the small daily indignities that she had trained herself not to feel because feeling them was too expensive. "How long do I have to think about it?" she asked. "I leave at the end of the week. I'll need until Friday." He nodded. That was apparently acceptable. He left, and Clara stood in her empty store, and the amber light came through the windows, and she thought about mountains. Friday came. She had not slept well in the 4 days between. She had made lists, practical ones, the kind her mind ran to automatically. What she would lose, the store, the familiar work, the town she knew even if the town didn't think much of her. What she might gain, she was less able to quantify that because it involved variables she didn't have data for yet. What she came back to, in the small hours of Thursday night when she was staring at the ceiling of her upstairs room, was not a calculation. It was a feeling. Not a warm feeling, not a sure feeling. More like standing at the edge of something and recognizing that standing there indefinitely was its own kind of choice. Boone arrived Friday afternoon. He came in without ceremony and stood at her counter. "I'll sell the store," Clara said. "It'll take a month to close the accounts properly. I won't leave it in disorder." He nodded. "I have questions," she said. "I'd expect so," he said. "The cabin. How many rooms?" "3. Small. 2 can be built out. Nearest settlement. 12 miles down the west slope. Crossings. About 200 people." "You trade with them?" "Furs mostly. Some game." "Do they have a supply operation?" "A poor one." She filed that away. "Water in winter." "Ice on the creek, but there's a spring that runs year-round up behind the east face. 20 minutes walk." "I can make that work," she said, almost to herself. "I know," he said. She looked at him. "You're not worried I'll be trouble?" He considered that with what she was coming to recognize as genuine seriousness, the man didn't dismiss questions or deflect them, which was unusual enough that she found it worth noting. "You'll be a particular kind of trouble," he said. "You've got opinions and you'll use them. That's fine. I've got my own and I'll use mine. We'll figure it out or we won't." "That's not very reassuring." "No," he said, "but it's honest." She sold the supply post to Gerald Fink, who had been eyeing it for 2 years anyway, at a price that was fair and not $1 less than that. She spent 3 weeks closing accounts and settling debts and writing out a clean ledger transfer. She packed what she owned into 2 trunks and a canvas bag, which was not much but was more than it looked like. The morning she left, a raw January dawn with ice on the puddles and breath clouding in the cold, she stood on the porch of what had been her father's store for the last time. A few people had come out to watch. Not many, and not because they were sorry to see her go. Mostly, they'd come to see if she'd actually do it. May Sutton was there. She said, "Clara, you don't have to do this. You can stay." Will what?" Clara said. May didn't finish the sentence. Boone's horses were loaded. He stood at the head of them, holding the reins without impatience, waiting the way he waited for everything, without performing the waiting. Clara picked up her bag and walked down the porch steps. She didn't look back at the store. She had thought she might, but when the moment came, she didn't. She walked to the horses and Boone helped her up onto the second one, and they rode out of Red Hollow with the frozen dirt road crunching under the hooves and the January wind coming at them flat and mean from the north. They rode in silence for the first hour. The town fell behind them. The prairie opened up, and then, slowly, the land began to change, the flat ground tilting upward in increments, the grass giving way to scrub and rock, the sky pressing lower and grayer. "I need to know the rules," Clara said, after a while. Boone glanced at her. "Rules. Your rules, the ones you've already got, the ones I'd be riding into without knowing." He thought about this. "Don't go past the north fence line without telling me. There's a stretch where the ground looks solid and isn't. Don't leave the fire unbanked at night. I found that out the hard way first winter. Don't touch the 4th trap in the east line. It's misfiring and I haven't fixed it yet. And," he paused, "don't tell me what I want to hear. Tell me what you actually think." "That last one won't be hard," Clara said. Something that was almost a smile moved across his face. Almost. They rode higher, The air changed, getting thinner and cleaner, and the cold deepened but became a different kind of cold, drier, sharper, the kind that felt honest about what it was. "Why haven't you done this before?" Clara asked. "Taken someone up with you?" "I have," he said. "Didn't work." "Man or woman?" "Partner I trapped with for 2 seasons. Couldn't stand the quiet." A pause. "Some people can't." "Can you stand noise?" she asked. "Depends on the noise." She thought about that. "I talk when I'm working," she said. "I think out loud. I probably narrate things." "I've noticed." She looked at him. "You noticed." "You talk to yourself when you're counting stock," he said. "Quiet, but you do it. I could hear you through the shelves." She felt something strange at that. Not embarrassment exactly. Something more complicated. The feeling of being heard when you thought no one was listening. "I can work on it," she said. "Don't," he said. "It doesn't bother me." They made camp that night in a shallow draw out of the wind. Competent camp put up with minimal wasted motion. Clara had camped before, with her father, but not often, and not in country this serious. She watched how Boone moved, and she copied what she could understand and asked about what she couldn't. He answered her questions without making her feel like they were stupid questions, which was more than most people did. She lay awake in her bedroll for a while, staring up at a sky that was absolutely full of stars. More stars than she'd ever seen from town. The kind of sky that reminded you how much sky there actually was when you got out from under the rooftops and the lantern smoke. She thought about Red Hollow, about May Sutton's unfinished sentence, about the particular shape of a life that had already decided it was finished. She thought about what Boone had said in the store. "I think you deserve better than what they've decided about you." Nobody had said that to her before. Not in those words, not in any words. And the plain, unadorned way he'd said it, not as a compliment, just as an observation. The way you noted that a piece of rope was being used below its rated strength had gone somewhere inside her that she hadn't known was available to be reached. She was scared. She was not going to pretend she wasn't scared. She had left everything she knew with a man she barely knew, heading into country she'd never been in, to a life she couldn't picture. But beneath the fear was something else, something that felt, cautiously and against her better judgment, like the beginning of something. The fire burned down to coals. The stars burned on overhead. Clara Whitmore, Clara, who nobody had wanted, who the town had filed away and considered settled, pulled her blanket up and closed her eyes and slept better than she had in 3 years. Oh. The valley appeared on the 3rd day. They had been climbing since before dawn, working the horses up a trail that wasn't really a trail, more a suggestion of passage through rock and frozen scrub, a series of choices Boone made without apparent hesitation that Clara had no way to second-guess and so simply trusted. Her thighs ached from the unfamiliar angle of mountain riding. Her face had gone numb somewhere around mid-morning and stayed that way. She had stopped narrating her observations around noon, not because she was being careful about it, but because the country had gotten serious enough that she needed her attention for other things. And then Boone stopped his horse on a wide shelf of rock, and Clara came up beside him, and there it was. The valley sat below them like something that had been placed there deliberately, a long crescent of flat ground cradled between 2 ridges, maybe half a mile wide at its broadest point. A creek ran through the middle of it, frozen along the edges but still moving in the center, catching the pale winter light. There were stands of pine on the upper slopes, and below them a stretch of open meadow that would be grass in spring, and at the far end, tucked against the eastern ridge, where it would get morning sun, a cabin. It was small. She had expected small. But it was solid. She could see that even from this distance, the way the logs sat true and the roofline didn't sag. "That's it," Boone said. "How much land?" Clara asked. "Valley floor's about 400 acres. Up the slopes I've got use of more, but I don't claim what I can't work." She studied it, the way the ridges sat on either side, the angle of the light, the way the creek curved. "South-facing meadow," she said. "That's good for a kitchen garden. Late start on the season, but workable. I put in a small one last year, didn't tend it right." "What did you plant?" "Beans, some squash. Beans will forgive neglect better than most things. Squash won't." She paused. Did anything come up? Some beans. Then the soil's not the problem. She looked at the slope above the cabin. What's up behind the east face? The spring I told you about. And above that, the upper pasture. I've been thinking about goats. She looked at him. Goats. For the milk. And the clearing. They'll eat down brush better than anything else. Goats? She said again, in the tone of a woman recalibrating her expectations. All right, we can talk about goats. Something in him seemed to relax fractionally, the way a man relaxes when a conversation he was braced for goes better than expected. They rode down into the valley. The cabin was 2 rooms with a loft, which Boone had described as 3 rooms, and which Clara decided to let go for now. It was tight. The main room held a stone fireplace, a rough-hewn table, 2 chairs that didn't match, and a set of shelves along the far wall that held his supplies in the organized but purely functional arrangement of a man who knew where everything was and cared about nothing else. The second room had a rope bed and a chest. The loft was accessed by a ladder and held apparently everything else. The bed is yours, Boone said. Where do you sleep? Loft's fine. She looked at the ladder. It was steep. You're telling me you climb that every night. I've been doing it 2 years. All right, she said. She put her trunks in the second room and came back out and looked at the shelves in the main room. She stood there for a moment, reading them the way she read supply inventories, assessing, categorizing, identifying gaps. You're low on salt, she said. I know. And you've got 3 different grades of rope in here, and I'm not sure why you need 3 grades. Different uses. Tell me the uses and I'll tell you if you need 3 grades. He told her. She decided 2 were sufficient and filed the information away. That first week was the hardest thing she'd ever done, and she had done some hard things. It wasn't any one thing. It was the accumulation of small unfamiliarities, the way the cold worked differently at altitude, getting into your joints in a specific way that the prairie cold didn't, the way the silence was textured and alive rather than empty, full of sounds she didn't know yet, the crack of the creek ice at night, the particular wind through the pines on the upper slope, the irregular percussion of a woodpecker somewhere on the eastern ridge that she couldn't locate for 3 days. She made mistakes. She let the fire get too low one night, and they woke to a cabin that was 20 degrees colder than it should have been, and Boone got up without comment and rebuilt it while she lay in her blankets feeling incompetent and furious at herself. She miscalculated how long it would take to get water from the spring in full winter gear and came back 40 minutes later than she'd planned, and Boone, who had been watching the tree line with a stillness that suggested he'd been watching longer than he wanted to admit, said nothing about it. You can say it, she told him. Say what? That I was slow, that I miscalculated. You were slow, he said. You'll be faster next time. That's it? What else would I say? She didn't have an answer for that, which irritated her more than criticism would have. She was not, it turned out, bothered by the silence. She'd expected to be. She was a social creature by profession, if not by deep preference, and she'd spent years surrounded by the ambient noise of a working supply post. But the valley's quiet settled around her differently than she'd expected. Not oppressive, more like something that asked you to be present in it. What bothered her, in that first week, was the feeling of uselessness. She didn't know this place yet. She didn't know its systems, its rhythms, the location of things, the logic of how Boone had organized his operations. She was used to knowing the logic of her environment down to the last nail and penny, and not knowing it made her feel clumsy in a way that went deeper than the physical clumsiness of new terrain. Show me the trap lines, she said on the 5th morning. Boone looked up from the harness he was repairing. You don't have to. I'm not saying I want to run them. I'm saying I want to understand them, the geography, how the whole operation works. A pause. All right. He took her out on the 6th morning when the weather held clear and cold and the light was good. They walked the east line first, 12 traps set through a stretch of timber above the creek, each one chosen for a specific reason he explained as they went. He didn't talk down to her. He spoke the way he seemed to do everything, directly and without decoration, and she asked questions and he answered them, and by the end of the east line she had a working map of the logic in her head. The west line's harder going, he said, as they came back down toward the cabin. How much harder? There's a slope that gets icy. You need to know where to put your feet. Show me. Not today. Weather's turning. She looked at the sky. It looked fine to her, but she'd learned enough in 5 days to know that her sky reading at altitude was not yet reliable. How do you know? He pointed at the upper ridge to the northwest. See how the cloud's sitting on that peak? Doesn't usually do that unless there's pressure coming in behind it. Give it 6 hours. She looked. She filed it away. How long did it take you to learn to read it? Still learning, he said. That was the first thing he'd said that surprised her, and she thought about it for the rest of the afternoon. The storm came in 5.5 hours later. She counted. There were things she was better at than she'd expected. The first was the accounting of it all. Boone tracked his supplies and trades in his head, which worked well enough but lost precision over time. Clara started a ledger, not her supply post ledger, a new one, bought in crossings the first time they rode down together. She tracked the trap yields, the fur quality by grade, the trade prices she could find out, the costs of everything they bought down in town. Within 3 weeks, she had a clearer picture of the operation's economics than Boone had ever had. You're making less than you think on the beaver pelt, she told him one evening, sitting across the table from him with the ledger open between them. He leaned over and looked at the figures. Harlan's been giving me fair market. Harlan's been giving you what he tells you is fair market. This, she put her finger on a column, is what the pelts were trading for in Milford last season, according to the freight agent I talked to when we were in crossings. There's a 12% difference. Boone was quiet for a moment. That's a significant difference. It is. Harlan's been trading with me 4 years. I know. I'm not saying he's a thief. I'm saying he's a businessman who's been paying you what he can get away with because you didn't have the information to push back. She paused. Now you do. He sat back, looked at the ceiling for a moment. I should have kept better track. You're a trapper, not an accountant. This is what I do. I know, he said. That's why I asked you. She looked at him. Is it? He met her eyes. One of the reasons. She let that lie. There were things between them that were still unresolved in the sense of neither being named nor causing immediate problems, and she had decided, practically, in the way she decided most things, that she would leave them unresolved until the situation required otherwise. What she noticed was this. He was a man who did not say things he didn't mean, which meant that the things he did say carried weight in direct proportion to their scarcity. The winter deepened. The work of surviving at altitude in January and February was real work, the kind that left you tired in your bones at the end of the day. Not the surface tiredness of worry and social maneuvering, but the clean, deep tiredness of physical effort that had accomplished something. Clara found, to her surprise, that she slept better here than she had in years. She also found that she and Boone had negotiated, without ever discussing it, a set of household arrangements that mostly worked. He cooked on the nights he came in first, which was most nights because she was usually still working at the ledger or figuring out some organizational system for the cabin's chaos. She cooked on the nights the work wrapped up earlier. Neither of them had commented on this pattern. It had simply emerged. This is better than what you usually make, she said one evening in February, when he'd produced a stew that was unexpectedly good. You sound surprised, he said. I am, a little. I've been cooking for myself 11 years. I had to get competent at something. You're more than competent. What did you put in it? Dried thyme, and I browned the meat first before I added the water. That makes a difference. Yes, he said. It does. She ate the stew and thought, not for the first time, that he was not what she had expected. She hadn't expected bad. She wasn't foolish enough to have ridden into the mountains with a man she thought was bad. But she hadn't expected this particular texture of person. The directness without bluntness, the competence worn lightly, the way he paid attention to things, to all things, including her, in a way she was not accustomed to being paid attention to. She was trying not to make too much of it. She had good reasons for that. In March, they rode down to crossings together for supplies, which they did roughly once a month. It was a 12-mile ride each way on terrain that was easier by March, but still required care. She had stopped tracking every footfall and started being able to look around, which she thought of as progress. Crossings was larger than Red Hollow, and rougher around the edges. It had grown up around a trading post and not quite settled into anything more organized than that. The streets were mud half the year, and the buildings were a mix of board construction and canvas. And it had the particular energy of a place that attracted people who had reasons to be somewhere off the main road. She noticed, the second time they came in together, that people looked at them differently than she was used to being looked at. Not as a joke, not with the particular pity she'd absorbed so thoroughly she could feel its shape. They looked at her the way you looked at someone who belonged to something recognizable. A partnership, a working unit, something with heft to it. Boone didn't seem to register this. He registered most things, but social atmospheres were apparently not what his attention ran to. It was in Crossings, in early March, that she first heard the name Victor Crow. She was in the trading post, looking over the available coffee. The quality had dropped since her last visit, and she was deciding whether to buy what was there or wait, when two men at the counter beside her started talking in the way men talked when they'd forgotten or stopped caring who was nearby. "Crow's got a crew up near the Alderson claim now," one of them said. "What's he after up there?" "Same thing he's after everywhere, gets his men to file the claim proper, then the original owner finds out there's a dispute, and by the time it goes to any kind of proceeding, Crow's lawyers have got the paperwork so muddy nobody can read it straight. That's the third one this year. Probably not the last. He's moving up into the higher ranges. Word is there's something up there worth moving for." The other man lowered his voice. "Silver?" A pause. "Something." Clara bought the coffee because the alternative was standing there longer, and she brought it back to where Boone was loading the pack horse and said, as neutrally as she could manage, "Who's Victor Crow?" Boone's hand slowed on the straps. "Where'd you hear that name?" "Inside, two men talking." He finished with the strap before he answered. "Land speculator, works out of the eastern settlements. He buys up claims or disputes them, or he has ways of making the paperwork come out in his favor." "Is he operating in this range?" "Not yet." "That's not a no," she said. He looked at her. "No," he said. "It's not." She thought about the valley, the way it sat between the ridges. The clean spring, the meadow that would be deep green in another month, the cabin with its solid logs and its misfiring fourth trap that Boone still hadn't fixed. "Has anyone told you there's something particular under this land?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment too long. "Boone. A man came through last summer," he said. "Geologist," he said. "Asked to look at the rock formation on the East Ridge. I let him because I didn't see a reason not to." A pause. "He got excited about something, tried not to show it, left quick." "And you didn't think that—" "I thought about it," he said. "I didn't know what to do with it." She looked at him. He was a man who knew every fold of mountain terrain for 20 miles in any direction, who could read weather in a cloud formation, who could track an animal through 3 inches of new snow. He was not a man who thought in terms of legal paperwork and land disputes and the specific kind of danger that wore a suit and hired lawyers. "I need to find out what's on your claim documents," she said. "What's registered, where the boundaries are, who knows about it." "The documents are at the county office, back toward Milford." "Then we need a copy." She tied off the last pack strap herself, checking Boone's work out of habit and finding it fine. "When we get home, we need to talk about this properly." "Clara!" His voice had something in it she hadn't heard before. Not quite uncertainty, but something adjacent to it. "It might be nothing." "It might be," she said, "but you know it's not." He didn't argue. She'd noticed that about him. He didn't argue against things he knew were true, even when the truth was inconvenient. It was one of his better qualities. They rode back up to the valley in the afternoon light, the horses picking their way with the ease of familiarity. The peaks caught the last of the sun above them, going gold at the tips. The valley was quiet below, the creek speaking its low, continuous language, and the pines moving slightly on the upper slope. Clara looked at it. Her home now, she supposed, though she was still acclimating to calling it that, and felt something that was partly the solid satisfaction of a place that was being built into something real, and partly a colder thing, a wariness that she had learned over years of running a supply post in a town that had opinions. The specific alertness of someone who has just heard a sound they don't recognize yet, but know enough to take seriously. Victor Crow. The name sat in the back of her mind the way names did when they mattered. She didn't know yet what she would do about it, but she had always been good at learning the logic of a situation, and she intended to learn this one before it learned her. The copy of Boone's claim documents arrived from the county office in Milford 6 weeks after Clara had written requesting them. 6 weeks during which she had done everything she could think of to prepare for information she wasn't sure she wanted. She had ridden down to Crossings twice more, asking careful questions of the kind that didn't announce themselves as questions. The freight agent who'd given her the pelt pricing information turned out to be a useful source of other things, too. A talkative man named Ord who liked being consulted and didn't seem to notice how much he gave away in the course of a conversation. From Ord, she learned that Victor Crow operated out of a land office in a town called Brentfield, 3 days east, and that he had acquired or disputed 11 separate claims in the past 2 years across the Upper Range territories. She learned that he employed a lawyer named Fisk, who had a reputation for finding technical errors in original filings that somehow always benefited Crow's position. She learned that at least 2 of the men whose claims Crow had taken had simply left, packed their families and gone, deciding the fight wasn't worth it. She didn't tell Boone all of this at once. She told him pieces of it, when the pieces were solid enough to be worth telling, and she watched him absorb it in that particular way he had. Still, attentive, not reacting outwardly but clearly processing. "He's systematic," she said one evening, the ledger open in front of her, though she wasn't looking at it. "He doesn't go after things randomly. He finds out what's worth taking, and then he builds a case for taking it." "And you think he knows about this valley?" "I think that geologist wasn't wandering around up here for his health." She paused. "The question is what he found exactly, and whether Crow already knows it." When the documents finally came, she read them twice before she said anything. Then she set them on the table and told Boone to sit down. He sat. "Your original filing is solid," she said. "Your father registered this claim in 1861, transferred properly to you in 1874. The boundary descriptions are clear on 3 sides." She put her finger on the page. "This side, the northeast corner, up along the rock formation on the east ridge. The language is ambiguous. It references a survey marker that may or may not still exist." Boone leaned over and looked. "The iron stake. I know where it is." "Is it still there?" A pause. "I haven't checked it in 2 years." "We need to check it," she said. "And if it's been moved or removed, we need to know that before anyone else does." They went up to the northeast corner the following morning. It was a hard climb. The east ridge was steep above the spring, and the rock formation that had excited the geologist was a long outcrop of pale stone that caught the light in a way that was distinctive, almost luminous, which Clara now understood was probably not incidental. The iron stake was there. It had been there a long time. Moss had grown around its base, and the ground around it showed no sign of recent disturbance. Clara felt something unclench in her chest that she hadn't fully recognized was clenched. "It's here," Boone said. "Yes." She crouched down and looked at it carefully. "But anyone who wanted to could say the description in the document doesn't match this location. The language is vague enough." She stood up. "We need a proper survey, a licensed one, with a surveyor who'll put his name to the findings." "That costs money." I know what it costs." She had been running the numbers in her head for 2 weeks. "We can do it. We'll need to pull from the winter savings." Boone was quiet for a moment, looking out over the valley from this height. From up here you could see the whole of it, the creek, the meadow, the cabin, the timber on the upper slopes. It was a good piece of country. Clara had known that from the first moment she'd seen it, but standing on the ridge above it, she understood it more completely. "All right," he said. "I'll write to the county surveyor's office this week." "Clara." He said her name the way he said most things, without excess, but with enough weight that you knew it meant something. "Thank you." She looked at him. He was looking at the valley, not at her. "It's my valley too," she said. He turned then. She hadn't intended the words to carry what they apparently carried, or maybe she had. She wasn't entirely sure, but something in the air between them shifted, the way air shifted before weather. "Yes," he said. "It is." They didn't say anything else about it. They climbed back down and went back to work. And if something had changed, it changed quietly, the way most real things did. The surveyor came in early May, a compact, serious man named Aldous, who charged more than Clara had budgeted and was worth it. He spent 3 days on the property, measuring and documenting and driving new markers where the old ones were ambiguous. He gave them a clean report with his signature and seal, and Clara made 2 copies and sent one to the county recorder's office and kept one in the tin box she'd bought in Crossings specifically for documents that needed protecting. If anyone disputes this now, she told Boone, they're disputing a license survey, not an old boundary description. That makes it harder for them. That makes it significantly harder, she agreed. Not impossible, but harder. She thought that might be the end of it. She was wrong. The first sign came in June. A rider, passing through the valley on what he claimed was a shortcut to the upper pasture country. He stopped at the cabin asking for water, which was reasonable enough, and he was polite about it, which was also reasonable. But he spent too long looking at the east ridge while he drank, and he asked one question too many about the rock formation up there. And when he left, he went northeast instead of northwest, which was not toward the upper pasture country by any route Clara knew. She told Boone that evening. Could be nothing, he said. Could be, she said. He had new boots, good ones, and his horse was better than a man passing through on a shortcut would usually ride. Boone looked at her. You notice those things. I notice everything. It was a supply post. She paused. He works for someone. 2 weeks later, 3 riders came down the West Slope Trail, the harder approach, the one that required knowing the country. They didn't stop at the cabin. They rode the valley perimeter in a wide circuit, stopping at intervals, and Clara watched them from the window with a cold, focused attention while Boone stood in the doorway. That's a survey crew, she said. Not official, but that's what they're doing. They're on my land. They're measuring your land, she said. There's a difference, and right now it matters more than the first thing. Boone's hand had gone to the rifle on its hooks beside the door. Clara put her hand on his arm, not holding him back exactly, just making her presence known. Not yet, she said. If we run them off with guns, we look like people with something to hide. Let them measure. We've already got the legal survey on record. He stood very still under her hand. She could feel the tension in him. Not anger exactly, but something older and more fundamental, the response of a man whose territory was being walked by strangers. All right, he said. But he didn't move from the doorway until the 3 riders had gone back up the west slope. The letter came in July. It was addressed to Boone Mercer and delivered by a rider from Crossings, who said it had come through the freight office from Brentfield. Clara recognized the name before she opened it. She read it once, quickly, and then set it down and read it again slowly. Victor Crow, Boone said. He was reading over her shoulder. He's claiming an overlap, Clara said. He says his company, the Crow Land and Mineral Company, holds a prior filing on the northeast quadrant of this property, the rock formation area. She turned to the second page. He's citing a document from 1858, 3 years before your father's filing. That's not possible. My father checked the records. Your father checked the records in 1861 with the information available in 1861, Clara said, keeping her voice even. Crow's lawyer Fisk has been known to find filings that nobody else finds until it's convenient. She looked at the letter again. He's proposing a negotiated settlement. We give up the northeast quarter. He drops the claim. He wants the ridge. He wants whatever's in the ridge. Yes. Boone sat down in one of the mismatched chairs. He looked at the letter the way a man looked at a thing he couldn't hit. What do we do? We write back, she said. We tell him we're aware of our filing history. We have a current license survey on record with the county, and we'd like to see the documentation for his claimed 1858 filing. Certified copies. She sat down across from him. Because either that document exists and we need to understand it, or it doesn't exist and we need to establish that on paper. And if it exists, then we deal with what's actually there, not with what he wants us to assume. She looked at him. Crow is betting we'll be intimidated, that we'll take the settlement because fighting it seems too complicated and too expensive. It might be. It might be, she acknowledged. But let's find out what we're actually fighting before we decide it's too much. She wrote the letter that evening. She wrote it 3 times before she was satisfied with it. Firm without being aggressive, specific in its requests, giving nothing away. She wrote it down to Crossings herself the next morning and sent it through the freight office with a return receipt. Crow's response came back in 10 days. He sent copies of the alleged 1858 filing. Clara spread them on the table and sat with them for 2 hours, going over every line. "There's something wrong with this," she said. Boone looked up from the harness he was mending. "What?" "The county recorder's stamp. It's dated 1858, but the format," she pointed. "I looked at every county document in our file. The recorder's office changed their stamp format in 1863. This stamp uses the post-1863 format on a document supposedly filed in 1858. Boone put down the harness and came to look. "You're sure?" "Look at our original filing from 1861. She laid it beside Crow's document. "Different stamp format. Then look at the surveyor's report from this May." She laid that down too. "Same format as Crow's alleged 1858 document." She sat back. "Someone created this filing after 1863 and backdated it." The cabin was quiet. Outside, the creek ran and the pines moved on the slope. "That's fraud," Boone said. "Yes," she said. "It is. Can we prove it?" "We'd need a county archivist to confirm the stamp format change and the date. That's provable. It's a matter of official record, but getting it proved in a way that means anything legally..." She stopped. "We need help. Someone who knows the legal terrain the way you know this mountain." "There's a man in Crossings," Boone said slowly. "Harlan mentioned him once. Not a full lawyer, but he's handled land disputes before. Name's Webb. Can he be trusted?" "Harlan trusts him. That's something." "Set up a meeting," she said. They met Webb at the trading post in Crossings the following week. A lean, older man with a gray beard and reading spectacles that he kept pushing up his nose. He read the documents Clara brought with the careful, unhurried attention of someone who had done this many times and stopped being surprised by human nature long ago. "The stamp's wrong," he said after a while. "I know," Clara said. He looked at her over his spectacles. "You spotted this yourself?" "I have a background in document management," she said, which was not precisely what it was, but was close enough. Webb sat back. "Fisk's work. I've seen it before, not quite this bold." He tapped the documents. "He usually targets people who won't look this closely." "He miscalculated," Clara said. "He did." Webb looked at Boone. "Your wife is a considerable asset in a situation like this, Mr. Mercer." Boone said, "Yes," simply and without elaboration, and Clara felt something move through her that she kept off her face. They were not married. They had never discussed marriage. They had built a life in the valley that operated on a shared understanding that had never been formally named, and Clara had decided months ago that naming it was Boone's prerogative if he wanted it named, because she was not going to push a man toward something and then wonder forever whether he'd meant it. But she heard the way Boone said yes, not as a correction of Webb's assumption, not as an agreement with it exactly, but as something that landed with the weight of a thing he'd decided privately and was simply not contradicting. She let it go. There were more immediate problems. Webb agreed to help for a fee that was steep enough to hurt, but not enough to be impossible. He would contact the county archivist's office about the stamp discrepancy, compile a formal challenge to Crow's filing, and submit it through the proper legal channels. "This will take time," he warned. "Crow's not going to sit still while we do this." "I know," Clara said. "What will he do?" "He'll escalate. He's done it before. When the paper fight doesn't work fast enough, he sends men." Webb looked at her steadily. "Are you prepared for that?" Clara looked at Boone. Boone looked at her. "We're prepared," she said. She believed it when she said it. What she didn't fully understand yet was what prepared was going to mean when August came in hot and dry and Crow sent not one rider or 3 but 11 men down the West Slope Trail, armed and carrying a paper that claimed to be a temporary injunction, and the valley that had been theirs for 2 years and her home for 7 months was suddenly full of strangers with guns, and Boone's jaw was set in a way she had never seen before, and her own heart was hammering somewhere up behind her sternum with a force that made it hard to think. She made herself think anyway. That was the thing about being Clara Whitmore. She had always been better under pressure than she looked, and the people who underestimated her had always eventually found that out. She looked at the 11 men in her valley. She looked at the injunction paper, which she read in full, while the lead writer watched her with an expression that said he expected her to be confused by it. She was not confused by it. She was reading it for the specific language that would tell her what Crow thought he had and what he thought he could do with it. She found what she needed on the second page. "This injunction is conditional," she said to the lead writer. "It requires the signature of the district magistrate in Milford. This has the signature of a justice of the peace in Brentfield." She looked up. "That's not the correct jurisdiction." The writer blinked. He hadn't expected that. "You can camp here tonight," she said, "because turning men away in this terrain at this hour is a cruelty I'm not interested in. But tomorrow morning, you're going to ride back down and tell Victor Crow that he needs to try again with paperwork that's actually valid." The writer looked at Boone. Boone was standing 6 feet behind Clara, and his expression communicated without any words at all that the conversation was with Clara, and he had opinions about how it should be respected. The writer looked back at Clara. Whatever he saw in her face made him decide not to push it tonight. They camped at the valley's edge, and Clara and Boone sat up late at the table with the lantern burning low between them. And Clara spread out every document they had and started building the things she was beginning to understand they were actually going to need. Not just a legal defense. A plan. The plan Clara built that night was not elegant. She would have been the first to say so. It was built the way she built most things, from what was actually available, not from what she wished was available. She had documents, a license survey, Webb's legal challenge working its way through the county system, and the specific knowledge that Crow's injunction paper was jurisdictionally invalid. What she didn't have was time, money for a prolonged legal fight, or any certainty that the system would move fast enough to matter before Crow decided paperwork was too slow and tried something that couldn't be argued with in a courtroom. What she did have was the mountain. Boone had been watching her work through it, sitting across the table with his coffee going cold, not interrupting. That was one of the things she had come to rely on, his ability to be present without filling the space with noise. "Talk me through the west slope," she said around midnight. He looked at her. "Why the west slope specifically?" "Because that's where they came in. 11 men. That's not a scouting party, that's a pressure crew. If Crow sends them back, and he will, he'll send more, and he'll send them the same way because it's the most accessible approach." "It's accessible until you get to the Narrows," Boone said. "About 2 miles up. Trail cuts between 2 rock faces, maybe 12 feet wide." "How long is the narrow section?" 60-70 yards. She wrote that down. "What's above it on the left side?" "Ledge system. Goes up maybe 40 feet. I've used it for goat tracking." "Can a person move along it quietly?" He thought about it. "If they know where to put their feet." "Do you know where to put your feet?" "Yes." "Then you can be up there without them knowing." She looked at the paper in front of her. "What about the east approach? If Crow wants to send a second group around to flank us, what does that route look like?" "Worse than the west. There's a creek crossing that's manageable in summer, but the bank on the far side is unstable. Half of it came down 2 springs ago. You can get across, but you have to know where." "And they don't know where," she said. "They don't know this mountain at all," Boone said. There was no pride in it, just the flat assessment of a man who had spent years learning something that most people hadn't. "That's what we have," she said. "That's the whole of it. They have numbers, and they have Crow's money behind them. We have the fact that we know this place, and they don't." Boone leaned forward and looked at the rough sketch she'd made. The valley, the approaches, the Narrows on the west slope. "You're thinking about slowing them down." "I'm thinking about making this mountain so inconvenient that Crow decides the cost of taking it is higher than whatever he'd gain from the silver." She looked up. "We can't beat 11 men in a straight fight, but we don't need to beat them. We need to stall them long enough for Webb's challenge to land, and we need witnesses for what Crow is doing so he can't quietly make this disappear." "Witnesses," Boone repeated. "People who can say, in front of other people, that Victor Crow sent armed men onto a properly filed and legally surveyed claim with fraudulent paperwork." She paused. "Who in Crossings would care about that? Who has reason to?" Boone was quiet for a moment. "Harlan. He's had his own trouble with Crow's people trying to strong-arm supply contracts." "Who else?" "The Dennett family runs cattle on the South Range. If Crow's moving into the high country, the Dennetts are next. They know it." "Would they come?" "If I asked them." She looked at him. "Then you need to ride to Crossings tomorrow. Talk to Harlan and Dennett both. I need you to bring them up here. Not as fighters, as witnesses. People who can say they saw what they saw. That means leaving you here alone. I know. Something moved across his face that was not comfortable with that. She held his gaze. I can manage one day. You'll be back by evening if you leave early. Clara. Boone. I need the witnesses more than I need someone standing next to me. He sat with that. She could see him working through it, the practical logic against whatever it was he felt about leaving her, which he hadn't named, and she wasn't going to make him name right now. I'll leave at first light, he said. Good. He left at first light, and Clara spent the morning doing two things simultaneously. She rode the West Slope Trail as far as the Narrows on foot for the last mile, studying the terrain with the same careful attention she'd given to supply routes and freight schedules and every other system she'd ever needed to understand. And she was scared, which she acknowledged to herself without dwelling on it, because fear was information, and you needed to know it was there without letting it run the thinking. The Narrows were exactly what Boone had described, a throat of rock that compressed the trail to a width where men would have to come through in pairs at most. The ledge system above the left face was real and usable, though getting onto it required knowing the one spot where the rock was stepped enough to climb. She found that spot and marked it in her memory. She also found, 50 yards past the Narrows on the valley side, a place where the trail ran along the top of a short embankment. The soil there was loose. She could see where last spring's melt had undercut the edge. It wouldn't take much to make it worse. Not a collapse, nothing dangerous, just enough loose ground to make horses nervous and men cautious, and the whole business of moving a group through that section slow and uncertain. She wasn't trying to hurt anyone. She wanted to make the mountain expensive in time and effort, not in blood. That was a line she knew existed and intended to stay on the right side of. She spent 3 hours on the west slope and came back to the cabin with dirty hands and a clearer head. Boone returned in the late afternoon with Harlan, who was exactly the talkative freight trader Clara had dealt with in crossings, and who had apparently been waiting for an excuse to be useful against Crow for longer than he wanted to admit. He also brought Tom Dennett, a weather-beaten cattleman in his 50s, who said almost nothing on introduction but looked at the East Ridge with the eyes of a man who had been watching his own back trail for some time. The Crow Land and Mineral Company, Dennett said, when Clara had laid out the situation. They came to me in May. Told me there was a question about my South Range boundary. I told them to show me the paperwork, and the paperwork they showed me had numbers that didn't match my filing. He paused. They told me I must have misread it. Did you misread it? Clara asked. I can read numbers, Dennett said flatly. Then you already know what this is, she said, and you know that if it works here, your South Range is next. He looked at her with the particular attention of a man recalibrating who he was dealing with. What do you need from me? Stay, watch. If Crow's men come back, and they'll come back, I need people here who aren't us. People Crow can't buy or dismiss. I can do that, Dennett said. Harlan was already nodding. I'll stay. And I'll talk. You know I'll talk. A pause. That an asset in this situation? An asset, Clara confirmed. They came back 2 days later. Not 11 this time, 15, and a different lead rider. This one older, harder-faced, with the kind of posture that said he'd done this work before and stopped thinking about it much. He had a new paper, and this time the jurisdictional issue had been corrected. It was a proper injunction out of the Milford District Magistrate's office, signed and stamped, ordering Boone Mercer to cease and desist any interference with survey activities on the contested northeast quadrant. Clara read it carefully while the lead rider watched her with the satisfied expression of a man who'd been told this time the paper was right. The paper was right. She had expected this. She had actually planned for it. This injunction addresses interference with survey activities on the contested quadrant, she said. It doesn't grant access rights across the remainder of the property to reach that quadrant. She looked up. You want to reach the East Ridge? You go around the north boundary. That's outside my property line. A pause. It adds about 4 miles. The lead rider stared at her. That's the property line, she said. Mr. Aldis's survey, filed with the county recorder in May. She produced her copy from the tin box and held it out. He didn't take it. You're welcome to read it. He looked at Boone. Boone was standing on the porch with his arms crossed, and Harlan was visible behind him in the doorway, and Tom Dennett had come around from the side of the cabin where he'd been checking on the horses. The lead rider took in the witnesses. He didn't like what he saw. "We'll be back," he said. "I imagine you will," Claire said. They went around the north boundary. It took them the better part of the day. Clara watched them go from the ridge above the spring, and she felt the tight, unpleasant satisfaction of a small victory that was not yet the thing that mattered. Webb's letter arrived 4 days later, and it was not good news exactly, but it was useful news. The county archivist had confirmed the stamp discrepancy in Crow's 1858 document. The format was definitively post-1863. Webb had filed a formal fraud allegation with the district court in Milford, but the proceedings would take weeks, possibly longer, and in the meantime the injunction remained valid. "Weeks," Boone said. "At least," Clara said. "Can we hold it that long?" She looked at him honestly. "I don't know. Crow's going to stop playing the legal game eventually. He's done it before. Webb said so. When the paper stops working, he escalates." "How far does he escalate?" "Far enough," she said. "That's what happened to the men who left." Boone was quiet. He walked to the window and looked out at the valley, the creek, the meadow, the pines on the upper slope. She let him look. She understood what he was looking at. "I built this place 2 years before you came," he said. "Before that, I was just moving through country, not staying anywhere long enough to care about it." She waited. "I don't know how to leave it," he said. "Not dramatically, just the plain fact of it." "You don't have to," she said. "Not yet. Maybe not at all." She came to stand beside him at the window. "But I need you to tell me something honestly." He looked at her. "If this goes badly," she said, "if it goes bad enough that holding on stops being possible, are you going to be able to make that call? Or is that going to be something I have to make for both of us?" It was a hard thing to ask. She knew it was hard, and she asked it anyway because she needed the answer. He looked at her for a long moment. "I don't know," he said. "I'm telling you that straight." "I know," she said. "That's why I asked." The escalation came on a Thursday, 10 days after the survey crew's second visit. Not 15 men this time, 5, which was in some ways worse because 5 meant something different than 15. 15 was a pressure move. 5, moving quietly down the west trail before sunup, was something else. Boone heard them. He had the hearing of a man who had spent years in wilderness where hearing things early was the difference between options and no options, and he was up and at the window while Clara was still surfacing from sleep. 5 riders, he said quietly. West slope, moving slow. She was dressed in under a minute. "Coming to the cabin?" "Not directly. They're angling toward the East Ridge access." She pulled on her boots. "They're going to try to establish physical presence on the ridge. If they camp up there and start pulling rock samples, the injunction protects them." "Yes." She looked at him. He was already thinking about the Narrows. "Go," she said, "the ledge above the left face. Get there before they reach the Narrows." "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to wake Dennett and Harlan, and then I'm going to do something that requires daylight and the presence of witnesses." She was already moving. "Don't engage them. I mean that. You're up there to watch and to be seen. That's all." She saw something in his face that was the tension between what she was asking and what he wanted to do, and she held his gaze until the tension resolved. "Seen," he said. "All right." He went out the back. She went to the room where Harlan was sleeping and knocked hard. What happened in the next 2 hours was not a battle. It was also not a negotiation exactly. It was something in between, a confrontation in which the weapons were information and visibility and the specific power of having witnesses in the right place at the right time. Clara rode the South Trail around to the Crossings Road at a pace that was faster than was entirely comfortable, and she arrived at the point where the county road met the Milford track just before the 2 riders she'd been expecting appeared over the rise. She had sent Harlan ahead of her, the night before, with a letter to Webb. She hadn't known exactly when she'd need what she was about to use, but she'd known she would need it, and Harlan's willingness to move fast and talk to people was the most useful thing about him. Webb was with the riders. He had brought the county archivist's written confirmation of the stamp fraud, certified and sealed. And beside him, on a road that converged on the mountain valley like the problem had been waiting for this particular morning to resolve itself, was a man Clara had written to 3 weeks ago on a piece of paper she'd been almost embarrassed to send. The district magistrate from Milford, a humorless man named Ord, who had come partly because Webb had been persuasive, and partly because, as he told Clara when they met, he had his own concerns about the volume of injunctions being filed out of his office bearing his signature in cases he hadn't fully examined. "You filed fraud documentation 4 days ago," Ord said to her, not to Webb. "Mr. Webb filed it. I provided the evidence." He looked at her with the particular attention of a man accustomed to dealing with aggrieved parties and recalibrating when they were more coherent than expected. "And you're telling me there are men on your property right now operating under an injunction I signed. An injunction that may have been obtained through misrepresentation," she said. "I'm asking you to come see the property, the survey documentation, and the original filing, and to be present when we speak to the men currently on the East Ridge access trail." Ord looked at Webb. Webb shrugged, which was the most useful thing he'd done all week. "Lead the way," Ord said. She led the way. The confrontation on the East Ridge access was not a dramatic thing, as confrontations went. The 5 men from Crow's crew came down from the Narrows onto the valley floor and found Clara Whitmore standing there with a district magistrate, a county archivist's certified document, a licensed land surveyor's report, and Tom Dennett watching from the slope above with the unhurried patience of a man who had made his mind up about something. The lead man, not the same one as before, a younger one who'd been given a job he now clearly wished he hadn't, looked at Ord and said, "Sir, we have an injunction." "I know about the injunction," Ord said. "I signed it." He looked at Clara. "Show me the survey document." She showed him. She showed him everything in the order she had decided on, presenting it the way she had once presented accounts to suppliers who needed to understand they were wrong about a number. Clearly, without drama, giving the evidence space to do the work itself. Ord read the archivist's confirmation of the stamp fraud. He read it twice. His face did something controlled and unhappy. "This injunction is suspended pending review of the underlying claim," he said to the 5 riders. "You'll leave this property now. Mr. Crow? Mr. Crow is welcome to appear before my court in Milford and explain the document his lawyer submitted." Ord folded the archivist's letter and tucked it into his coat. "I'd suggest he come prepared." The 5 men left. Clara watched them go and felt something she was careful not to let become too large. This was not finished, and she knew it wasn't finished, and letting relief arrive before the actual end of something had burned her before. But when she turned and found Boone coming down from the ledge above the Narrows, he had been there the whole time, watching, as she'd asked him to. And when he walked across the valley floor to where she stood with the tin box of documents under her arm, she let herself have the small thing. "It's not over," she said. "No," he agreed, "but we have the magistrate's eyes on it now. Crow can't quietly make it go away." Boone looked at her. He had dirt on his hands from the ledge rock, and something in his face that was not quite relief, and not quite gratitude, and wasn't something she had a word for. Something quieter than either of those things. "I couldn't have done this," he said, "without you here." "I know," she said. And then, because she was Clara Whitmore, and she was not in the habit of making things smaller than they were. "And you kept me safe long enough to do it. So." He nodded, slowly. Somewhere above them on the East Ridge, the pale rock formation caught the morning light and held it. The weeks after Magistrate Ord's visit were not peaceful. Claire had not expected peaceful, and she was glad she hadn't, because peaceful would have left her unprepared for what Crow did next. He didn't send men, he sent letters, a different kind of weapon, quieter, and in some ways more corrosive. Letters to the county recorder's office questioning the validity of Aldis's survey. A letter to the Freight Association in Milford suggesting that Boone Mercer had obstructed legitimate mineral survey operations. A letter, most troublingly, to the district court in Milford alleging that Ord had exceeded his authority in suspending the injunction without a formal hearing. Clara read copies of all of these because Webb forwarded them to her, which was one of the better decisions she'd made in hiring him. She sat with them at the table on a Tuesday evening in late August, the lantern burning, the creak audible through the open window, and she read each one carefully enough to understand what Crow was actually doing. He was building a paper record, not to win in court, not yet, but to make the dispute look complicated enough that a neutral party would see two sides instead of one clear wrong. If everything looked contested, Crow's fraud became a matter of competing interpretations rather than a plain fact, and plain facts were the only thing Clara actually had on her side. "He's good at this," she said. Boone looked up from across the table. "Good at what?" "Making things muddy, making it hard to see where the bottom is." She set down the last letter. "He doesn't need to win. He needs people to get tired." "Are you tired?" She thought about it honestly. Her back hurt. She'd been sleeping badly for 2 weeks, waking at small sounds she couldn't always identify. She had a headache that came and went in cycles she couldn't predict. "Yes," she said, "but not the kind of tired that stops you, just the kind that makes you feel the weight of everything." Boone was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I've been thinking about something." She waited. "Webb mentioned that the hearing in Milford, the fraud allegation, they'll want witnesses to establish the pattern of what Crow's done. Not just this claim, others." "Yes, that's what makes it a pattern instead of a one-time dispute." "The men who left," Boone said, "the ones who gave up their claims. Crow probably thinks they're gone and quiet." Clara looked at him. "You know where they went?" "One of them, Dale Hurst. He filed on a valley claim about 15 miles north of here, and Crow's people disputed it 2 years ago. Dale packed his family down to the settlements east of Crossings." A pause. "I knew him some. Not well, but enough. If Hurst would testify to what happened to his claim, it's the same pattern, same lawyer, same kind of paperwork problem that appeared out of nowhere." Clara felt something sharpen in her thinking, the way it sharpened when a gap in an inventory suddenly filled and the whole account balanced. "Can you reach him?" "I can try." "Try," she said. Boone rode east the following week. Clara stayed on the property because she was not going to leave it empty. Not now. And because there was work to do that didn't require 2 people. She finished a letter to Webb laying out the argument she'd been constructing about the pattern of Crow's operations, citing every specific detail she'd gathered from Ord the freight agent and Tom Dennett and her own documents. She spent a day writing the property lines, not because she expected trouble that particular day, but because knowing the land was something she kept working at, the same way you kept sharpening a tool that you knew you'd need. Dennett had stayed. He'd sent his ranch hand home after the first week, but stayed himself, sleeping in the cabin's loft. Boone had moved back to the second room when Clara took the loft, an arrangement they'd arrived at without discussion sometime in June, and proving to be a quiet, useful presence who fixed things without being asked and ate whatever was put in front of him without complaint. "You're not worried about your own place?" Clara asked him one evening. "My place is fine for now," Dennett said. "My foreman's got it." He looked at his coffee. "Crow went after you first because you're fewer people. If this holds here, he'll think twice about my range. And if it doesn't hold here, then I've got a better idea of what I'm dealing with when he comes for me." He said it plainly, without self-pity. Either way, it was worth coming. Boone came back with Dale Hurst on a Thursday, 9 days after he'd left. Hurst was a lean, weathered man in his 40s with the careful eyes of someone who'd been burned before and hadn't finished being cautious about it. He shook Clara's hand and looked around the valley and didn't say much at first. That evening, sitting at the table with coffee, he talked. What had happened to his claim was not identical to what was happening to theirs, but the shape of it was the same. The appearance of a prior filing that didn't quite hold up under scrutiny, the lawyer Fisk, the escalating pressure, the injunction from a jurisdiction that was barely applicable. The difference was that Hurst had been alone, without the documentation Clara had built, and without anyone who knew the legal questions to ask. "I just ran out of fight," he said. He said it without particular shame, the way a man stated a thing that was true and that he'd made his peace with. "I had a wife and 3 children, and I couldn't see how to win it, so I left." "Would you testify to what happened?" Clara asked. "In Milford, in front of the court." Hurst looked at his hands. He took his time. "My wife's not going to be happy about this." "I know. I'm not asking lightly. What would it cost me?" "Time. The trip." Whatever risk comes from having Crow know you're an active witness against him. He sat with that. The lantern threw its light across the table, and outside the valley settled into its night sounds. The creek, the pines, the intermittent percussion of something moving in the timber on the upper slope. He took my place, Hurst said finally. Took it and sold the mineral rights inside of 6 months. I found that out later. A pause. My father built that cabin. I'd like to at least make what happened to it mean something. It'll mean something, Clara said. I'll make sure of it. The hearing in Milford was scheduled for the second week of September. Webb had worked it faster than Clara had dared hope, partly because Ord was motivated, a district magistrate with reason to believe his office had been used to rubber-stamp fraudulent claims, had a personal interest in resolution, and partly because Webb was better at this than his fee suggested. They rode to Milford in a group that was larger than Clara had expected. Herself and Boone, Dennett, Hurst, Webb, and Ord the freight agent, who had turned out to have his own documentation of conversations he'd had with Crow's people about supply contracts, and who had written it all down in a ledger with dates and names, because, as he told Clara, he'd always had a feeling it would come in useful. You wrote it all down, Clara said, looking at the ledger. I keep records, Ord said. Force of habit. She understood that completely. The courtroom in Milford was smaller than the drama of the situation seemed to require. A low-ceilinged room in the county building with wooden benches and a judge's bench that needed refinishing and windows that let in the particular flat light of a September afternoon. There were perhaps 30 people in the gallery when the hearing began, which was more than Clara had expected for a land dispute in a mountain territory. Victor Crow was there. She had not seen him before, and she looked at him with the same careful attention she gave to everything she needed to understand. He was a trim man in his late 50s, well-dressed by frontier standards, with a composed, pleasant face that reminded her of certain suppliers she'd dealt with at the post. The ones who smiled steadily and adjusted their prices when they thought you weren't watching. He had a lawyer with him who was not Fisk. Fisk, she had heard, was indisposed. She suspected Fisk had decided to be indisposed once the stamp discrepancy surfaced in official documentation. Crow looked at Clara across the courtroom, and she looked back at him, and neither of them said anything. The proceedings were not cinematic. Legal proceedings rarely were, and this one moved at the particular pace of a process that had its own internal logic and couldn't be hurried. Webb presented the stamp discrepancy evidence. The county archivist confirmed it in testimony that was dry and precise and worth its weight in gold. Hurst testified about his claim and what had happened to it, speaking carefully and without drama, and the specificity of it, dates, names, the exact language Fisk had used, was more damaging than anything theatrical would have been. Dennett testified about the approach Crow's people had made to him in May. Ord put his ledger into evidence. Crow's new lawyer was competent. He questioned each witness with the skeptical precision of someone trying to introduce doubt into a room that was not particularly doubtful. He suggested that the stamp discrepancy could be a clerical error. He questioned whether Hurst's memory of events 2 years prior was reliable. He was doing his job, and he was doing it adequately. Clara sat beside Webb at the table and watched all of it and waited for the part that mattered most. She testified last. She had thought carefully about how to do this, not what to say, because she knew what to say, but how to carry herself in the saying of it. She had spent her life being underestimated by people who looked at her and saw something that didn't command respect, and she had learned that the response to that was never performance. You didn't perform competence. You demonstrated it by being exactly as competent as you were, in full view, and let people catch up. She walked to the front of the room. She had the tin box. She set it on the table in front of her, and she began. She laid out the timeline from the beginning. The geologist's visit, the letter from Crow, the jurisdictional flaw in the first injunction, the license survey, the archivist's confirmation, the 5 men on the East Ridge access trail. She cited specific document references. She quoted specific language from the relevant filings. She connected each piece to the next with the precision of someone who had been keeping track of all of it from the first moment the name Victor Crow had come through the wall of the Crossings trading post. Crow's lawyer cross-examined her for 40 minutes. She answered every question specifically and without agitation. And when he tried to reframe her answers, she corrected the framing with the same level patience she'd used when suppliers tried to quote her wrong prices at the post. She was not rude, she was not rattled, she was simply, thoroughly correct. At one point, the lawyer said, "Mrs. Mercer, isn't it possible that you've been mistaken about the intent behind—" "My name is Clara Whitmore," she said. "And no, I'm not mistaken about intent. Intent is demonstrated by a pattern of action, and I've documented that pattern. You've seen the documentation." The lawyer paused. The judge, who had been making notes with the steady application of a man determined not to show preference, glanced up. The hearing ended at 4 in the afternoon. The judge's ruling came 3 days later in writing, which was how Ord said it would go. The Crow Land and Mineral Company's 1858 filing was found to be fraudulent. The document was struck from the county record. The injunction against the Mercer property was permanently dissolved. The case was referred to the Territorial Attorney's Office for further investigation into the Crow Land and Mineral Company's other filings in the district. Webb read her the ruling in the Trading Post in Crossings, where they had been waiting, and she sat with it for a moment. "It's referred for further investigation," she said. "That means they'll look at the other claims, including Dale Hurst's." "Possibly," Webb said. "These things take time." "But it's on record." "It's on record." She folded the letter and put it in the tin box, beside the survey report and the original claim filing and the archivist's certification and all the other pieces of paper that had been, in the end, the actual weapons in this fight. Victor Crow left the territory before winter. She heard this from Ord, who heard it from his network of freight contacts the way Ord heard everything. The Crowland and Mineral Company's Brentfield office closed. The territorial attorney's investigation was ongoing, and 2 of the other claims Crow had disputed were under review. Whether Hearst would get his valley back was not something anyone could promise. These things moved slowly, and the machinery of land law in frontier territories was not built for speed. But it was moving. Clara thought about this on an October morning, standing at the spring behind the east face, waiting for the water to fill the bucket, watching the way the light hit the pale rock of the ridge formation above her. The air had the particular cold clarity of autumn at altitude, clean enough to feel in your lungs, sharp enough to wake you up to the fact of where you were. She had not fixed what had been broken in the people who'd been driven off their land. She had not undone 2 years of Crow's operations with a 3-day hearing. The world had not reorganized itself around the principle that the right outcome should be the one that happened. What she'd done was draw a line in a specific place and hold it, and make sure the right people were watching when she did. That was all. It was also not nothing. She heard boots on the rock path behind her and didn't turn around because she knew the sound of his walk by now. "Bucket's almost full," she said. Boone came and stood beside her. He looked at the rock formation above them, the same view she'd been looking at in the way he sometimes did, sharing a thing without needing to describe it. "Webb sent a final invoice," he said. "I know, I already wrote the bank draft." "You didn't tell me." "I was going to tell you at dinner. It's not an emergency." He was quiet for a moment. "We're going to be short on salt again. I ordered it through Ord. It'll come with the November freight." He looked at her. She could feel him looking at her even though she was watching the ridge. "You ordered it through Ord. He gives better prices when you build a relationship with the supplier rather than buying at whatever rate the trading post sets. I've been working on that since spring." Another pause. "Clara." "What?" "When do you stop?" She looked at him then. He meant it as a genuine question, not a complaint. She could tell by now the difference between the things he said that were complaints and the things he said that were trying to understand something. "Stop what?" "Managing everything. Seeing what needs doing and doing it before anyone else knows it needed to be done." She thought about it, honestly. "I don't think I do," she said. "It's not a thing I turn on. It's just how I think." "I know," he said. "I'm not asking you to stop. I'm asking if it's all right. If you get tired of it." That landed differently than most things landed. She stood with it for a moment, watching the water fill the bucket. "Sometimes," she said, "sometimes I get tired of being the one who sees the gap and fills it, and nobody notices because the gap was never there from their point of view." She paused. "But you notice. You have for a while. So, that's different." He didn't say anything for a moment. Then, "I want to ask you something." She looked at him. He was looking at the ridge, not at her, which she had learned was how he handled things he wasn't entirely comfortable with. "We've been living like we're married for 9 months," he said. "And I know I didn't ask you properly. I know I asked you something different in the store, and then everything was what it was, and the time for asking properly kept not arriving." He turned then and looked at her with the direct, unadorned attention she'd grown so accustomed to that she'd stopped noticing it except in moments like this when it landed with its full weight. "I'm asking now, if you want it official." It was not the kind of proposal women in Red Hollow would have recognized as romantic. There were no specific words to it, no ceremony. It was a man acknowledging a thing they'd both been living as fact and asking whether she wanted it named. She understood exactly what he was saying. She understood it the way she understood supply lines and property boundary descriptions and the format changes in county recorders' stamps, completely without gap. "Yes," she said, "I want it official." He nodded. Something in him settled. They got married in Crossings 3 weeks later, in front of Harlan and Tom Dennett and a justice of the peace who seemed faintly surprised by the complete absence of ceremony from both parties. It took about 15 minutes, which was longer than Boone had expected and about what Clara had expected. Harlan cried, which nobody had anticipated, and which he denied immediately and without any credibility. Winter came on properly in November. The cabin was warmer than it had been the previous year because Clara had spent 3 weeks in October caulking gaps and reorganizing the firewood storage to account for heat distribution, and because the second room had a small secondary stove now that Boone had installed in September without telling her and revealed one morning by simply lighting it. She had looked at the stove and then looked at him. "When did you—" "Last month, when you were working on the south garden bed." "You didn't tell me." I wanted to see if it drew right before I said anything about it. She had stood there in the warmth of it, this small, unexpected thing, and she had felt something that she didn't have a ready word for. Not surprise, not gratitude exactly, but something in the neighborhood of both weighted with the specific tenderness of being known by someone who paid attention. The valley changed with the snow. It became a different kind of place, quieter, the distances compressed by white, the world reduced to the immediate and the necessary. She had expected to find this difficult, and in some ways she did. There were days when the cabin felt very small, and the weather made going out impossible, and she and Boone were in each other's company for 20 hours out of 24, and there was no buffer of other people or other tasks. They had arguments, real ones, about real things, about how much credit to extend to a family in Crossings who were behind on a trade agreement, about whether to take on a second string of traps on the North Slope, about a decision Boone had made about timber without consulting her that she found out about secondhand. They were not smooth arguments. She said sharp things sometimes when she was tired. He went silent in ways that lasted too long and had to be waited out. None of it broke anything. All of it was the texture of two people sharing a life rather than merely sharing a space. She thought sometimes about Red Hollow. Not with longing. She hadn't longed for Red Hollow since approximately the third day on the trail out of it, but with the detached curiosity of someone examining a thing from a sufficient distance to see its shape clearly. She had believed for a long time that what the town thought of her was a reflection of something real, that the consensus of so many people about her worth and her prospects had to contain some truth, the way a consensus about a price or a supply level usually contained information even when it was wrong in the specifics. What she understood now was that consensus was just the aggregate of what people decided to see. Red Hollow had looked at her and decided to see the gap between her and the thing they expected a woman to be. Boone had looked at her and seen something else, not because he was more perceptive by nature, she didn't think that was it, but because he was looking for something different. He was looking for someone who could survive real conditions, and real conditions had nothing to do with what Red Hollow was measuring. The lesson in that, the things she'd turned over and examined from different angles through the long, quiet evenings of that first winter with him, and the second winter that was now settling in around them, was not that she had been right and the town had been wrong, though both of those things were true. The lesson was that the judgment of people who aren't looking at what actually matters tells you almost nothing about what actually matters. She had almost believed them. That was the part that stayed with her, not with shame, but with the careful attention you gave to a near miss. The recognition that the thing that almost happened had been real, and that you'd gotten out of it not through certainty, but through a decision made at the edge of her own capacity to keep going. She had gotten on a horse and ridden into the mountains with a man she barely knew because the alternative was staying in a place that had already decided her story was finished. That was all. It wasn't bravery in any large sense. It was just barely enough refusal to accept what she'd been handed. And from that, barely enough had come the valley, and the survey, and the hearing in Milford, and Hearst's testimony, and the tin box of documents that sat on the shelf in the main room now between a jar of dried thyme and a coil of rope, and Boone's hand on her shoulder on a cold morning when she was making coffee and couldn't feel her fingers yet, and the goats they'd finally gotten in October who were more trouble than Boone had promised, and exactly as much trouble as she'd expected. In January, a letter came from Dale Hearst. The territorial attorney's investigation had resulted in a finding in Hearst's favor. The Valley claim was being restored to his original filing. He and his family intended to go back in the spring. Clara read the letter twice. She went to the window. Outside, the snow was doing what snow did at altitude, moving in lateral sheets past the glass, indifferent to everything. She thought about a man who'd run out of fight getting his cabin back, his father's cabin. She thought about what it cost to be the kind of person who stayed in a fight when leaving was easier. And she thought about what it was worth. And she thought those were two different calculations that didn't always come out the same. Boone came in from the woodpile, knocking snow off his boots, and she handed him the letter without comment. He read it and handed it back. "Good," he said. "Yes," she said. That was all. It was enough. Spring came eventually, the way it always did at altitude. Not all at once, but in negotiations. A warm day followed by a cold week, the creek widening gradually, and the south meadow going green in patches that expanded slowly toward each other. Until one morning, Clara looked out the window, and the whole of the valley floor was the color of something starting over. She stood on the porch that morning with her coffee, and she looked at all of it. The meadow, the creek, the east ridge with its pale rock catching the early light, the garden plot she'd expanded over the winter's planning, the goat pen Boone had reinforced with better timber after the third escape in November. She was 30 years old. She was not the woman Red Hollow had expected her to become. She was not, truthfully, the woman she had expected herself to become, back in the time when she was still letting other people's expectations take up too much room in her thinking. She was something she didn't have a category for yet, and that was all right. Categories were useful, but they weren't the thing itself. The thing itself was this valley, and this work, and this life that had been built from a decision made at the edge of her capacity and then defended, document by document, through a summer that had tested everything she had. Boone came out and stood beside her and looked at the same valley. "The south fence needs work," he said. "I know. I put it on the list." "You have a list." "I have 3 lists." He drank his coffee. The morning settled around them, the particular light of spring at altitude, clean and unhurried. "Clara," he said. "What?" "Nothing," he said. "Just said your name." She looked at him. He was looking at the meadow, a small thing at the corner of his mouth that wasn't quite a smile but was in the same family as one. She looked back at the valley. Some things didn't need more than that.